Thanks for joining me. I couldn't go through Constitution Day, which is today, um, without doing at least a brief video on the importance of the Constitution and what a wonderful document this is and why it matters today. What's it been? 233 years later. It is especially important now in 2020. It's an important time to remember that the only reason that our country exists is because the colonial English citizens that occupied the land that we're on right now, because they sought economic freedom against what they saw or who they saw were tyrants. It was the oppression of the British government, who had a king and a parliament that forced laws on us without allowing us any participation in that process. That is the entire reason that we fought a revolutionary war and that we earned our freedom, that we won our freedom. But how do you join all these separate colonies who were basically separate sovereign states after the Revolutionary War together and to tie them together as different segments of this rattlesnake, that each segment, kind of like the Balkans and Europe, or all of these European countries, as a single nation, they can't do much. But as a united collection, we were able to do anything. And the last 233 years have proven that it was the greatest conception of a state that ever occurred. And it created the greatest quality of life and the best country that has ever existed. And sure, there have been problems along the way, but there has never been any society freer than we ever were. You know, one of the great speeches of American history to look back on, especially today, is the speech by Frederick Douglass. And that was the speech, what is the 4th of July to a slave? Or what is a slave to the 4th of July? And in that wonderful speech that Frederick Douglass gave, he talked about the Constitution first and foremost. And he said, "Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery." And that's exactly the truth, is that our founding fathers anticipated that slavery, which was started by England, remember, we were English colonies, and England itself didn't abolish slavery until the mid-19th century. So it was 1840s. They were slave traders. In fact, they were the slave traders that brought most of the African slaves into North America. So we were English colonists. That's what they had given us. And there were attempts, including by the colony of Virginia, to abolish or limit or restrict slavery before the Revolutionary War even. But it was vetoed by the King of England. It was vetoed by Parliament. So we took what we were born from and we created this document on this day 233 years ago that was able to tie together these northern states that did not generally have much slavery, and the southern states whose economy was built on slavery by England. Now, England was the largest slave trader to North America. It wasn't American colonists. It was English corporations, English companies, English lords, English nobility. So England created that. If we're going to cancel our culture or anyone's culture based on the fact that slavery occurred, well, then the Queen of England needs to denounce her throne, and we need to rename England. We need to completely cancel England. We need to completely cancel pretty much every old European power, because the fact is the United States was is an infant country in the timeline of world powers, such as England. The United States Constitution is the greatest document that has ever been created in the history, in all of recorded history in the world. And why is that? Because ever since our founding fathers created that document, it's been copied the world over. It's been replicated by every major and minor democratic country around the planet. And without the principles in our Constitution, there would be no such thing as a free society. It would be impossible. There was no real such thing as separation of powers. Now, why are separation of powers important? Well, we can see here in West Virginia what happens when you have no separation of powers. Power in the hands of any one man or any one group of men, it only increases and it becomes tyranny very, very quickly. So the whole idea behind the Constitution by our founding fathers was to protect the entire country by pitting the tyrants against each other. So all government officials, all leaders are capable and will become tyrants if given the chance. It seems the only person really in our history who didn't want to become a tyrant was George Washington himself. So the framers of our Constitution designed it in such a way, assuming that we have a bunch of tyrants and we're tied together as this confederation of states. And they created these separate branches of government, and they assuming that it would be occupied or they would be occupied by tyrants. And so they pit the tyrants against each other. So you have tyrants in the legislative branch. Well, who's going to stop them from just increasing in power? Well, that's going to be the executive branch. And also we'll have a judicial branch. So if we have tyrants on each side, rational thought tells us that they're going to be fighting against each other for power. Therefore, if everything works properly, the power will balance out. So, without our Constitution, the world would be a despotic place, like you find the further away you get from our country, like you find with the authoritarian regimes in the Far East, like you find in the Middle East. The closer you get to our country, the closer you get to freedom. So when we first fought the Revolutionary War, we have to remember that it was for economic reasons. It was for economic freedom. Fast forward 233 years later, and what's happening now? We have, say, in our state, we have one man who our founders assumed would be a tyrant. Okay, we have a tyrant, and there are no tyrants in any other branch that are seeking their own power, and so by design would challenge that tyrant's power. So we have unchecked power in the hands of one tyrant. So what does that tyrant do? He locks us down. He shuts down our economy. In his own words, he's reopening our state. Well, how can you reopen something without it first shutting down? So he shut down our state, and he's reopening our state under his own provisional government, where he gets to say how barbershops open and when barbershops open and how restaurants open and when restaurants open and who gets to open and who has to stay at home. Well, that's not how our system was set up, because our founders knew that politicians would always be tyrants. And that's why the whole idea of our system of government was checks and balances. And right now, we, in our state, in many other states, there are no checks, there are no balances on these tyrant governors who are drunk with power. So we need to remember that we're the greatest country in the world because we had the guts to fight for our freedom because we were being suppressed economically. We were a wealthy group of colonies for England, and they were making money off of us, and they didn't want to let us go. And they didn't want us to personally grow rich like they were. And remember, the way that wealth worked in the old world, in the old country, was it was passed down and kept in families. There really was no prospect of being born poor and working your way up because you had good work ethic and you were smart and then becoming rich. It was rare. It really didn't happen. The best way to do it was through the military. Sometimes the only way to do it was through the military. And it was for these reasons that Virginia, in West Virginia, we were Virginia pre-1863. One of the reasons that so many of the founding fathers came out of Virginia and that so much great political philosophy and political ideas that ended up forming our country came out of Virginia is because of the way things were set up in England, that all the wealth, in order to keep it in these families, it would only go to the firstborn son. So what Virginia did, we started to seek the second-born sons and the third-born sons from these wealthy, educated families in England. And we tried to attract them to Virginia because we're getting educated, smart people, but they have no prospects in England. So a lot of our early Virginians were of those type. And that's how we got this early, like, aristocracy of political debate and thought that would, created Thomas Jefferson and George Madison and James Monroe and James Madison. So that was something that was really kind of special about Virginia. And it had to do with getting away from the history of the old world where the country was ruled by a bunch of Bill Gates types or Jeff Bezos types, and they would keep their wealth in their family by law passing down to their firstborn. So out of that were the ideas from these second-born and the third-born sons of England and their children to change the way things happened in this country. So after we fought the French and Indian War, England had a lot of debt, and they were using us in the colonies to pay off those debts, those war debts. And so they started really hammering us financially to pay off those debts. And that's when we started to get pissed off about it. And we started to hear the term no taxation without representation. Well, long before that was something that you saw on Priuses around Washington, D.C., it was the political idea of the time during the third quarter of the 18th century in America. No taxation without representation was a phrase born because Parliament would not allow us a seat at the table. So they're passing these laws that affected us economically, and we were English citizens just as much as somebody in England was. And think about that for a second. We are English citizens. We're not on English proper soil. We're not on the island, but we're an English colony. We're not a second class of citizens. Yet we're not given a seat at the table. And they're sticking it to us with some of the import-export laws. For instance, we had to, if colonists wanted to sell cotton or tobacco, they would make it so we had to ship it to England first, and then they would ship it from England to France or to Spain or to the Netherlands, wherever. So what was the result of that is now we have a middleman and our profits are way less. And we had a lot of natural natural wealth. And at the time, land was wealth in the 18th century. It absolutely was. And it's like 90 something percent of the people made their living off of the land. So following the French Indian War, interest rates are rising. The money supply began to dry up. Interest rates rose. Mortgages on real estate skyrocketed. And instead of helping their colony, England made things worse and sued the colonies to fix its own economic problems. So that's where no taxation without representation started. That's why the Rev War was fought. So the colonists, we had King George III at the time, but even he wasn't as powerful as King Justice VIII here in West Virginia, who can do anything he wants, apparently, and nobody stops him. There's no parliament to have to approve anything. Our legislature is completely missing in action. But King George III had to deal with parliament. And who do you have in parliament? You have a lower house and an upper house, like would end up in our legislatures. But the upper house in England was the House of Lords. And it wasn't just people elected by the peasants. These are the people that inherited the money, inherited their power. These were the lords. They inherited their titles. So they were making the political decisions that were enriching themselves personally at our expense. And we were doing all the work. Hell, we cleared the land. We fought the Indians. We fought the damn French. And they're making the money off of us. So there were a number of economic laws or policies that came out of England, came out of Parliament, that we were pissed about and formed the phrase, no taxation without representation. Going back to 1733, they passed a law called the Importation Act that required all colonial exports to be sent to England first. I talked about this, and also in British ships. And so what did this do? This deprived American businesses of really the entire world market. And at that time, we're talking about the rum trade, sugar, molasses, rum from down in the Caribbean. And in 1750, it got worse. Parliament declared that Americans were not allowed to manufacture steel, so we couldn't compete with British steel manufacturers. They stopped us from harvesting large pine trees in our country. Of course, we had this endless forest of huge trees. And you needed large timber to be able to build these huge ships of war. And of course, England was the largest navy that was ever created. So they relied on these ships, and you had to have a good source of wood for this. And so they stopped us from being able to export our wood to other countries. We could only export to England. 1761. Parliament passed a law authorizing customs officers to forcibly enter businesses and search for smuggled goods. Well, there is a legal challenge here in the colony. During the trial that ensued, James Otis, a Boston patriot, stated, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." So remember, these are British subjects, British citizens, not a foreign country, not foreign citizens. Yet they're receiving these unfair restrictions. And at the same time, they're prevented from having a seat at the table in Parliament. So that may have been one of the first times that phrase appears in our history is 1761. James Otis, taxation without representation is tyranny. So what is it? What is a lockdown without representation? Well, if taxation is tyranny, if you don't have representation, well, is there a word worse than tyranny? Is there something worse than tyranny? If there is, that's what we're living under right now. 1765, the Stamp Act. Parliament passes the Stamp Act. That imposes a direct tax on the American colonies, requiring that basically anything in print has to use paper that's produced in London that has an embossed stamp on the paper. This was newspapers, all legal documents. And how did we respond? Kind of the same way that we respond now with a lot of things, and that's with a boycott. Sometimes when you don't have any representation, that's the only thing you can do. We don't like what the NFL's doing, so we don't watch it. We don't give them our money. The Stamp Act ended up being repealed shortly thereafter in 1766. So the boycott was successful, but tyrants don't go away that easily. So Parliament responded the next year with the Declaratory Act, which was a new set of taxes and regulations with the main purpose to show the colonists who the boss was, to show us that they can do as they wanted and that we'd put up with it and we'd like it. We'd be happy to get what we get. But it was clear that they weren't going to give us any direct seat at the table. They weren't going to give us any representation. 1767, 1768, we had the Townshend Acts. That was from Parliament, again, a series of laws designed to raise money on our backs. Trade restrictions. They punished New York for failing to quarter their troops. They asserted the absolute right to tax the colonies, again, with no representation. There were many patriots that stood up and they resisted. Again, they used boycotts and they physically resisted. By 1770, what happened? The Boston Massacre. So 1770, most of the taxes by then, we had put up enough of a fuss that the Townshend Acts were repealed. But there still was a duty, a tax, an import on tea. And they kept that in place, not because they really made all that much money off of it, but they just kept it there just to piss us off, just to show us that they're in charge. And it didn't go well. So what happened in 1773? The Boston Tea Party. And that didn't make England happy at all. So then they passed what were called the Intolerable Acts. And that was basically just to punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party. And those were more harsh laws, again, enacted without representation, just to punish us. So when we signed the Declaration of Independence, we asserted what were called the 27 grievances against England. So it wasn't just the words that you've heard and that Biden cannot remember that were in the Declaration of Independence. But we actually laid out 27 things that we were pissed off about, and we were asking them to fix. 27 things that we were pissed off about. And you know what was in there that you would never learn from the media, that you would never learn from the college professors or in the public schools? Well, one of the things that we were complaining about in the 27 grievances was slavery, that we had tried to enact as colonies legislation to limit or outlaw slavery, including in 1763. And England wouldn't let us do it. So if people try to say that America was born from slavery, that we're this evil country, there are documented instances of us trying to limit or outlaw it, but we weren't a free nation at that time. We had to fight a war before we got there. And we actually included that in one of our 27 grievances against England. We also complained about the economic restrictions. We complained about the lack of other rights that we didn't have as English colonists, and that was the lack of any fair trial, the lack of any real rights with our colonial legislatures. They could pass a law, but Parliament could veto it, or King George III could veto it. And they could just abolish our legislatures, and that happened in North Carolina. I believe it happened in Virginia as well. So if they didn't like what our legislature was doing, they could just abolish it. So you'll see that many of these grievances that we listed in the Declaration of Independence ended up making their way into this document, the United States Constitution. And it wouldn't end up ratified until about 15 years later, and after many lives of patriots were lost. John Adams said that a constitution of government once changed from freedom can never be restored. Liberty once lost is lost forever. So I ask you here, 233 years later in 2020, have we changed from freedom? Have we lost liberty? Because if we've lost it, there's no getting it back. Why is it important to resist living under the rule of a one-man state government? Living under the rule of a king, of a tyrant, of a dictator? Even if you think he's done a good job, which many people do, you'll see on social media, I don't agree with Governor Justice politically on a lot of stuff, but I really got to say he's done a great job with this COVID-19. He's really kept us safe, and he's done a lot of good stuff where other states didn't. So even if you believe that that's the case, that he's done a good job, you have to look at the bigger picture, that the absolute necessity that's more important than anything else, including our lives, is to preserve our rights and our liberty under our constitutions. Because once you allow one governor to play dictator, you must therefore then, by circumstance, allow the next to do the same. And you might not like who the next dictator is or how they handle the next crisis. And you might not like his choices, but by then it would be too late. Thomas Jefferson said that timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty. He said that on April 24th of 1796. So what does that mean? It kind of means that freedom is scary. That people who are scared, they prefer dictators because it's calm. It's safer. The sea of liberty is boisterous. There's going to be danger involved. It's not always as efficient. Therefore, we have to follow the rules. And the rules are laid out in our two respective constitutions, the United States Constitution and our state constitution. The state constitution really is simple and very well written. We have two houses of legislature. They enact the laws, and the governor enforces the laws. This is a distinct separation of powers. And like our founding fathers had said, we have to assume that all men would be tyrants if put in the position of being a dictator, of being a king. And the only real design of dealing with the natural tendency of human beings of being tyrants is to pit them against each other in an exactly identical, equal way, so that it will create a stalemate, essentially, a stalemate of freedom. And we've violated that stalemate. We've allowed that stalemate to be completely carried away under fear. And fear is what all tyrants, all dictators have used to take their power. That's what Hitler used, was fear. The burning of the Reichstag, which of course the Nazis did themselves. But they were successful in instilling fear in the people. We can look at what happened after 9/11 here with the Patriot Act. Look at our government, the size of our government, the size of our criminal law pre-9/11 to after 9/11. Now, I'm not saying that it wasn't Osama bin Laden that did that. That's not where I'm going with this at all. It was. But men being tyrants, what did our federal government do? The Patriot Act. They took control of our lives. They took control of our freedom, of our information, because the people were afraid. So anytime the people can become afraid, a tyrant can take power, or the government can gain power. But we always lose freedom. Let's see. So here in West Virginia, we have to use Constitution Day to teach our children, to teach students that our country was created out of economic tyranny and no taxation without representation. At the heart of our entire country is representation. And it wasn't created perfectly, but it has improved over the years. And that's the way it was designed. And, you know, since the original Constitution Day was 1787. And do you know when the Bill of Rights itself was added? 1791, several years later. It wasn't until then that all of the states ratified the Constitution, because it's not something that we could force. These were all technically separate sovereign entities. They had to voluntarily agree to enter into being a United States. That included states with slavery. That included states really without slavery. So we had to find this middle ground. And that created the most free country that there ever was in the history of the world. Now, it wasn't completely free. There was a lot of work to do, and a lot of work was done, including the inevitable Civil War, which came, which 600-something thousand people died during the process. And I'll return back to the great speech by Frederick Douglass about what to the slave is the 4th of July. So Frederick Douglass, and slavery was still a thing, and he was fighting against slavery. But his outlook on it wasn't to try to turn us into some foreign country. Frederick Douglass knew that there was still no other country in the world, especially including in Africa, that was a free country like we already were. His efforts were at getting rid of the abomination of slavery from within our country, because it is consistent with our Constitution to do so. Again, our Constitution was not built on slavery. It was designed to one day, as soon as possible, get rid of it. He ended his speech, and I'll put it up on my website here, when I have time. He said, "The fiat of the Almighty, let there be light, has not yet spent its force. No abuse, no outrage, whether in taste, sport, or avarice, can now hide itself from the all-pervading light. The iron shoe and crippled foot of China must be seen in contrast with nature. Africa must rise and put on her yet unwoven garment. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hand unto God. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it, God speed the year of Jubilee, the wide world o'er, when from their galling chains set free, the oppressed shall vilely bend the knee, and wear the yoke of tyranny like brutes no more. That year will come, and freedom's reign to man his plundered fights again restore. God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow, and every clime be understood. The claims of human brotherhood, and each return for evil good, not blow for blow. That day will come all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend, each foe. God speed the hour, the glorious hour, when none on earth shall exercise a lordly power, nor in a tyrant's presence cower, but all to manhood's stature tower, by equal birth. That hour will come, to each to all, and from his prison house the thrall go forth. Until that year, day, hour arrive, with head and heart and hand I'll strive to break the rod and rend the gyve, the spoiler of his prey deprive, so witness heaven, and never from my chosen post, whatever the peril or the cost, be driven. Again, that was Frederick Douglass, I believe in 1853 on the 4th of July. The only other thing is, I was reminded of this here. This is a musket that was used in the Rev War. And you can see, well, you probably can't see, but it's got a surcharge on the bottom where it says "Use States." And George Washington had to order that put on our first muskets, which were French, sold to us or given to us by the French. This is a French musket. And that's what we use to fight England. And this one that I always keep back here, this was really the symbol of tyranny. This was the Brown Bess. This is what the British used. Brown Bess musket with a bayonet on the end. And if you didn't pay the taxes, you wanted to resist, this is what you got. You got the bayonet. So we have the American musket versus the British Brown Bess musket. So that's Constitution Day. And I think it's important to remember that this document has been in effect for 233 years now. And it's guided us through a lot of things, including a civil war. It's guided us through slavery to the end of slavery. And there's still nothing in that document that is not consistent with all men being equal the way they are right now. There was never any guarantee that everything would be perfect or equal in practice. But the guarantee is that we would all be equal under the law, and that's the way it's turned out. So we were given a design. All we have to do is to continue to follow it, and it will navigate all the issues that we're dealing with now. I have no doubt. The answer is not going to be to throw it out the window and adopt something completely different. Because what is completely different? What is it that these other groups are trying to get us to adopt? That is the tyrannical form of government that we left to begin with. And although all these people think that they're going to be in the leadership of this new government and therefore they're going to be spared, in the end, we know from history that they're all going to be up against the wall. They just don't know it yet. So anyways, thanks for watching, and have a happy Constitution Day, and I'll see you next time.